Today's reading comes from about the middle of the story of Esther. And it's a very interesting story, and it's one of only 2 books in the Bible in which God isn't mentioned. God's presence is obvious in the flow of the narrative and the things that happen, but God isn't in it at all. But coincidence after coincidence does show that even though his name isn't there, that God very much is in the book of Esther. And I think it's a great picture of how our lives seem to work, where we don't usually get the obvious God movements, but we can see him moving in the way that things just kind of happen. So now the book of Esther is set in a time after many Jews returned from Persia into Israel. It's set a couple kings down the road from when a lot of people returned from exile, but a lot of the Jews didn't want to leave what had been their home for so long. And so they stayed around the area and they continued to be in the Persian Empire. So this book is set in roundabouts 483 BC. It's in the 3rd year of King Xerxes I. And the book spans about 10 years worth of goings on, ending around 473 BC. In the opening scene, King Xerxes is throwing parties. And now he's not just throwing any parties, he's throwing some major parties. The book says they last 6 months long. Now, at one of these parties, the king summoned his queen, Vashti, to come into the party. And having there been so many parties, Vashti wasn't about to get herself ready and go out to another party. She was just done. And so she didn't. Now, the king was very unhappy with this, and after a very misogynistic rant from his officials about how if the king doesn't punish this, all our wives will think that they don't have to do what we say either. And so the king issues a decree that it's time to find a new queen. Now, before we get too much farther into the story, there's something very important that I need to talk about. The story of Esther is essentially the origin story of a Jewish festival called Purim. Now, this festival is actually celebrated in March, but I want to use one of the traditions from the festival in today's sermon. So we're going to be a little interactive today. Now, I know we're Lutherans, we're not good at this, but it's easy, I promise. So whenever you hear the name Mordecai, I want you guys to go, yay! Can you do that? So, Mordecai. Okay. Whenever you hear Haman, I need you to boo. So Haman, Mordecai, Haman. Okay. So just pay attention as we go through the story because this is very important. So with the king looking for a new queen, he starts to have an empire-wide beauty contest in which all of the women of the empire are gathered together for the Miss Persia pageant. And of course, the winner of the pageant does not get a scholarship, but gets to become the next queen. Now we hear about an orphan girl named Hadassah, also known as Esther, who is being raised by her cousin or uncle, it's not very clear, named Mordecai. Esther was entered into the queen contest and along with many other women underwent a year of training and beauty treatments. And at the end of the year, the women would go before Xerxes and whichever one he liked best would be the new queen. After a couple years of waiting in the house of the women, Esther finally gets her chance to go before the king. She asked the eunuch in charge of the women for advice in what to do, and after following his advice, Esther becomes the new queen. Now, it just so happened that around this time, Mordecai overheard a plot by some of Xerxes' officials to have Xerxes killed and replaced. Mordecai reported this to the proper channels, and it was written in the king's records that this person named Mordecai had foiled a plot against the king. Now, There is a method in storytelling that when you write a story, you don't put anything in the story unless it's important later. So note, this was written in the king's records. Just keep that in the back of your mind, right about here, right in the back of your mind, just because it becomes important. So a little bit more time passes. Esther is the queen, and a real jerk face named Haman starts to come to power. He was given an order by the king that whenever he walks down the road, everyone had to bow down to him. And so one day, Haman was walking down the road, and he happens to look over, and he sees Mordecai standing above all of the people bowed down. Now, Haman, being a right and boo-worthy jerkface, was very unhappy about what Mordecai was doing. So Haman came up with a plan. I got you there. This plan was not just to punish Mordecai, not just to punish his family, but to punish his entire race for Mordecai not bowing down to Haman. And so Haman went to Xerxes, and he told Xerxes, there's this group of people, they don't respect the king's law. And with this very generous donation, how about you pass a law that gets rid of this entire race of people? And so the king said, well, I like generous donations to the treasury. I don't see any problem with this law, so let's just send it to the entire empire that all the Jews will die and their property be seized. When Mordecai heard about this order, he was incredibly and understandably distraught. He dressed in mourning clothes, and all the other Jews with him dressed in mourning clothes. And he got a message to Esther to tell her about the pogrom. After a little bit of prodding and some back and forth between servants, Mordecai convinces Esther to go before the king and beg for her people's salvation. Now there's a problem. Anyone who goes before the king unbidden is subject to death unless the king holds out his golden scepter and shows favor. And Esther hasn't been called to the king in a month. And so Esther and Mordecai decide to have a fast, a time of fasting for all of the Jewish people, while Esther gets ready to go before the king. So Esther goes before the king, and the king holds his scepter out to Esther. And Esther proposes a feast to King Xerxes for him and for Haman. When he hears about this, Haman is overjoyed. He is super excited that a feast is going to be held in his honor, but he's still a little grumpy that Mordecai is still around. He is very vexed by Mordecai. And so Haman builds a giant pole on which to have Mordecai impaled. Now, it just so happened that night, Xerxes couldn't sleep. So as you do when you couldn't sleep, he calls his servants in to read to him government bureaucratic records. And if you can't sleep, that's a pretty good place to start, I would think. So they start to read, and all of a sudden, he hears a note that a guy named Mordecai discovered a plot against Xerxes. And Xerxes is horrified that Mordecai was never celebrated for it. Now Xerxes looks out across the courtyard and he sees that Haman had just come in. So he calls Haman into his chamber and he starts to ask Haman how Xerxes should celebrate someone who has earned the king's favor. Now, this Haman is downright giddy. He is so excited that he thinks that the king is going to throw a giant feast for him. And so Haman starts to describe all of these extravagant things that need to be done to the person who the king wants to celebrate. And then Xerxes says, oh great, do all that for Mordecai. At this point, Haman is mortified because his enemy is the one that's being celebrated. But he can't wallow in his shame for very long because there's Esther's feast to think about. At the party, Esther tells the king about the plot to kill all of her people and take their goods, and Xerxes is greatly distressed. He's very offended now that his plan affects someone that he actually cares about. He asks Esther who is responsible for this horrific plan. And Esther names Haman. The king at this is aghast and he leaves the room in anger. But while the king is gone, Haman approaches Esther, gets on the couch that she's sitting on and pleads with Esther. And right then, the king walks in again. The king is, of course, utterly horrified that one of his trusted officials would attack the queen. And so Xerxes has Haman killed on the same pole that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. Mordecai is given all of Haman's ranks, and Mordecai drafts a law that repeals the pogrom against the Jews, a day that eventually becomes remembered in the Feast of Purim. Wasn't that fun? Now, I've told some of you, but I won't tell you in the sermon how you're supposed to celebrate the Feast of Purim. If you really want to know, catch me after church. But, so stories like Esther with these things that just so happen. Esther just happens to be picked as Xerxes' new king. Mordecai just happens to hey, you remembered, good job. He just happens to overhear a plot against the king. The king just happens to solve his insomnia by hearing the story of that plot. Haman, it warms my heart. Haman just happens to be the kind of jerk face who would cause his own end. These are all presented as just happenstance, but if you really pay attention, you have to start to wonder, how could this all have happened? All of these coincidences coming together to save God's people without God being involved. Esther presents all of these things as just coincidences, but they're too unlikely to just be coincidences. Stories like Esther remind us that even when it seems like God isn't obviously doing something, when we look for them, we can see his actions behind the scenes. I can point to any number of situations in my own life when, maybe not in the moment, but definitely looking back, I can see God working by making things happen that wouldn't have otherwise happened. When I was applying for seminary, for instance, I was getting really stressed out that I was going to get all of my applications done in time. In particular, the one that was stressing me out the most was the financial aid application. That one's kind of important, right? And just in the moment when I was most stressed about it, I got a phone call saying that the deadline had been pushed back a month. Just one of several things that just happened to go on while I was getting ready to go to seminary. I really appreciated the random happenstance, but now I can see what God was doing. And I'm sure we can all look at times in our lives when coincidences happened in just the right way to be for our benefit. And when we're looking for God's work in those coincidences, it's obvious. I know for me, when people ask me why I believe in God, that's the things that I point to. That there are things that have happened in my life that I can't explain any other way. So that I know that there is a God out there who loves me and wants my best. God working through those coincidences in our lives are evidence of Him for me. And I think we can all point to those times in our lives that we can see that God is truly, as we sang in our opening hymn, Emmanuel, God with us. A God who cares about us enough to work through happenstance in our lives, to build those strings of coincidences that lead us to the best path for us. Because that's what God does. God looks out for His people. And even when we might not see some big, huge thing that's very obviously God, we can see Him in the little things in our lives, the coincidences, the things that are more than just random chance, and know that He loves us, know that He wants our best, and that remind us of who He is and how much He cares about us, that even those little things matter to Him. And that's the kind of God that we celebrate.